Hong Kong, the most vibrant city in the world, is also the most depressing city in the world. What was once a small village on the coast of the South China Sea has today become a financial hub of Asia and has served as a gateway to mainland China for several decades. However, under the surface, it's a capitalist nightmare, where the rich get the most luxurious lives while the poor live in illegally subdivided apartments called cage homes that look like this. Many elderly who can't find other jobs spend their days picking cartons that they can sell to recyclers and get themselves some food. If you think this is the life of only a few poor people, then no, it's not a few households. In fact, 23% of Hong Kong's households now live in poverty, and thus are living out some of the darkest days today. But why? When Hong Kong is such a rich city, yet so many citizens suffer, who is to blame? The short answer is Britain. How so? This is the story of the dark side of Hong Kong. Colonial setup. How did we get here? The story begins in the early 19th century when Britain and southern China engaged in trade, tea for silver. But Britain introduced something far more sinister into the equation: opium. The spread of the drug in Chinese society led to outrage, retaliation, and eventually war. The First Opium War broke out, ending in 1842 with Britain's victory and acquisition of Hong Kong Island. 18 years later, the Second Opium War further expanded British control to the Kowloon Peninsula. And finally, in 1898, a 99-year lease was signed, extending Britain's reach over the new territories and solidifying its grip on Hong Kong. Under British rule, Hong Kong was initially administered like any other colony. However, for the next century, the territory became a refuge for countless illegal Chinese immigrants. Driven by the crippling poverty of the mainland, including the devastating Great Chinese Famine of the 1960s, many sought opportunity and survival in Hong Kong, transforming it into a unique cultural and economic melting pot. That brings us to a relatively more modern era, the 1970s, when Britain decided to go all in, or better yet, all out, on its Hong Kong experiment. Let's break it down. The experiment was rooted in a simple yet controversial capitalist idea. Government regulations that interfere in the private sector stifle growth. According to this philosophy, the less the state intervenes, the more the economy can flourish. To test this theory, Britain introduced something called positive non-interventionism in Hong Kong, a radical version of capitalism. Here's how it worked. The system prioritized four things: free trade, open markets, low taxes, and virtually no government safety nets. In Hong Kong, there were no tariffs or customs to deter investors, no minimum wage, no pensions, and no regulation on businesses. Social welfare? Practically non-existent. Britain believed this hands-off approach would supercharge economic growth. And to be honest, it did. Between 1970 and 1997, Hong Kong's per capita GDP exploded from $960 to over $27,000. But this success comes with a caveat. While the wealthy thrived, poverty grew deeper. Hong Kong became a playground for the rich, but a nightmare for the poor. The effects of this extreme economic experiment are still painfully visible in the daily lives of many Hong Kong people. So what exactly does that look like now? Life in today's Hong Kong. Take a look at this one neighborhood in Hong Kong. This is Peak, Hong Kong's most prestigious neighborhood, which is also the least affordable on the planet. A neighborhood home to some renowned billionaires such as Jack Ma and Li Shaoqi. Places like the Peak provide all the luxuries that one can ask for. It's like a world on its own. But within the same city, there's another world too.
Actually, in Hong Kong, we have two worlds in one city. I think it's just you go to another world.
But what is the other world? We'll discuss that too. But before that, if you enjoy learning more about today's economic stories, be sure to subscribe and click on the bell icon so you don't miss out on any of our videos. Take a look at these cages that look like they're made for animals. But to many poor and elderly Hong Kong people, these are the only homes they have belonged to for decades. As life is extremely expensive in Hong Kong, many can't afford to rent, so they have two options. Either they end up on the streets for the rest of their life, or live in these illegally subdivided apartments.
From here to here is 6 foot, and the width of the bed is just 2.5 feet.
This lifestyle may be humiliating and depressing, but it is neither rare nor cheap. More than 200,000 Hong Kongers pay around 2,500 Hong Kong dollars, or 318 US dollars, to live in these tiny, inhumane cages. Most residents of these cage homes are living on welfare and give half of their pay in rent. The rest they spend on all other necessities, and thus sometimes cannot afford to eat 3 meals a day.
Many of the cage dweller, they cannot afford 3 meals a day because they need to save money to buy the toilet paper, even buy water sometimes.
But hey, don't worry, not everyone lives in such tiny places. Some have it relatively better. But the key word here is relatively. Those who can afford it live in relatively larger units, covering an area of 75 to 140 square feet. While this may be bigger than those 12 to 15 square foot cage homes, it's not always bigger than the average parking space in the US, which is 120 square feet. These units are also subdivided apartments, with each unit having a bed, a table, and some extra space.
有啲就條理，有啲就求求其其咁樣。嗰啲唱 K 啊嗰啲啦，同埋啲水啊嗰啲藥品啊，好簡單嘅啫。
Most such apartments have some shared area with a washroom and kitchen. The British experiment of positive non-interventionism has made life a living hell for hundreds of thousands of Hong Kong's people. But the UK isn't the most hated country in Hong Kong. Despite this inhumane lifestyle, Hong Kongers still have freedom and democracy. Or should I say, they had. Firstly, freedom and democracy in Hong Kong have an expiry date, June 30th, 2047. But it appears as if the expiry date has already arrived. Let's understand the expiry date first, and then we'll look into how they've already lost their autonomy. Transfer of power. The 99-year lease was supposed to expire, and lands acquired in 1898 were to go back to China in 1997. However, that lease did not include these lands. So how did the two countries deal with that? Well, the two countries decided that Britain would leave the entirety of Hong Kong for good, and China would respect its autonomy for the next 50 years, administering it as an SAR, or Special Administrative Region. Basically, one country, two systems. Until a few years ago, Hong Kong had a reputation for massive protests against China and Chinese forces punishing anyone for protesting. Britain is somewhat responsible for this chaos. Okay, wait. I can already hear some of you typing large paragraphs in caps lock. But hang on, we'll get to China too. But to analyze Britain's mistakes, to understand this, let's compare the situation with neighboring Macau's. Macau, just like Hong Kong, is a Chinese SAR with an almost similar history. There are only two major differences. First, Macau has a much smaller population, not even 10% of Hong Kong's. Second, it was a Portuguese colony, not an English one. Today, where Hong Kong is known for its massive protests against China, Macau is calm and cool with how things are going. To find out why, let's take a look at the attitude of two colonial powers in the 1990s. Portugal acknowledged that Macau's sovereignty would be transferred back to mainland China and tried to ensure that people have a healthy political and emotional connection. Two countries keep healthy relations today, and this gesture surely plays a major part. On the other hand, the British instilled their ideas of democracy in the minds of Hong Kongers, despite knowing that this would not help in their relations with the mainland and the Communist Party. How China treats Hong Kong. Thanks to the British, the Chinese government had to put in extra effort to establish healthy relations with Hong Kong. And in the last few years, we can see them putting in that extra effort. In February of 2018, a Hong Konger allegedly murdered his pregnant girlfriend while holidaying in Taiwan together. The murderer fled Taiwan and returned to Hong Kong. Taiwanese authorities requested the Hong Kong government to extradite him, but they couldn't comply as there was no extradition treaty between Hong Kong and Taiwan, and the man went unpunished. But to avoid such instances in the future, when the government proposed changes that would allow the Hong Kong government to consider requests from any country for the extradition of criminal suspects, even countries with which it doesn't have an extradition treaty, including mainland China, Taiwan, and Macau, people feared that these changes to the extradition laws would put anyone in Hong Kong doing work related to the mainland at risk of being sent there.
Like, how dare you do something like that before 2047 when we were supposed to still have our autonomy? I was quite worried that people were not going to respond.
Well, people did respond as massive protests broke out. The government did not approve of these protests and responded to protests with violence. In 2020, the government imposed a national security law, making protests illegal. There was barely any resistance this time, and it seemed as if the Hong Kongers had accepted their defeat. In the end, China won, and Hong Kong lost as its people got silenced. But this wasn't the first time that Hong Kong had lost. Earlier, Britain won with its experiment as Hong Kong became the Asian tiger, while Hong Kong lost as it became a nightmare for its poor citizens. You may think this is the story of Hong Kong, but this is the story of the whole world. Powerful countries often make decisions without considering what it might do to the common people, but are never held responsible for their actions. We don't know if Hong Kong will ever be able to get out of this situation, but we hope it does. Just like we hope you enjoyed today's video. Let us know your thoughts on the topic. Do you think Hong Kong will ever be able to make its way out of this dire situation? Also, who do you think is more responsible for today's messed up Hong Kong? Is it China? Is it Britain? Is it both? Share with us what you think, and don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to stay tuned. See you in the next video.